Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. I was looking at the calendar, which I don't actually often do, and I had to laugh because it's Roger Waters' birthday, and it's also a day that David Gilmour is releasing his first solo album in around 10 years. And that just made me think at least the guys in Pink Floyd still have a sense of humor. So I want to talk about both of them today and the brilliance they brought to the music. And let's start with the man of concept, Roger Waters, because I firmly believe that if Roger wasn't the poetic and conceptual and theatrical and visual and ideological genius that he is, Pink Floyd probably wouldn't have survived more than 3 or 4 years after Sid Barrett, the songwriter and the sort of leader of the band, after he left, facing a mental crisis of his own. Um, there was this period, obviously, sort of when you had albums like Saucerful of Secrets, and some of the soundtracks, like to the film More, where Pink Floyd was making still really good music, but it was sort of searching for a center, searching for an anchor, and Roger really provided that increasingly, first on metal, then a bit more on Obscured by Clouds, but it was really when the band retreated to make Dark Side of the Moon that Roger created his first of many masterpieces. It had all of the hallmarks of everything that would go on to define the Pink Floyd and Roger Waters sound. It was a concept album, it had unified themes, it had incredibly beautiful, poetic lyrics, but whose meaning was always very direct. Even when dealing with metaphor and even when dealing with rhyme, Roger has always been able to be one part philosophical and one part very direct. And this was in an era when you could really get away with lyrics that were not direct, that did sort of beat about the bush, that were not really one thing or the other, but not in Pink Floyd's case. The lyrics really spoke to people, and I think that there's a real therapeutic element to Rogers' lyrics. It's one part about the personal, about the psychiatric, about the individual, and then there's another element that is about universal themes, ecumenical themes, war and peace, love and hate, division and unity. And he's been able to combine these seemingly dualistic concepts throughout all of the albums on which he wrote his lyrics. 75's Wish You Were Here continued many of these themes. It also explored corruption in the music industry, the distance between friends, the distance between yourself and your desires and your ability to want to maintain sanity in a world that even then was going increasingly insane. Animals, another brilliant masterwork, a sort of a pun on Animal Farm, but updated for the 1970s. And then at the end of the decade, there was, of course, The Wall, a story that quite literally combined messages about war and peace, obedience versus individuality, abandonment versus a need to find dependency in a relationship. All of these concepts told through sort of two signposts, tales of the Second World War and tales of this young rock star named Pink and what he was going through. And this was something that Roger would continue to develop more and more. There was the film version of The Wall, which kind of strayed a bit from the original vision, but I think was a lot better than most people give it credit for. There was the all-star cast production of The Wall in Berlin in 1990. And then in the 2000s, he took The Wall for around 10 years or so, maybe just under 10. But for many years, he took it on the road in a huge production that really hammered home the ecumenical themes of war and peace, freedom versus censorship, all of these very prescient issues that have only become even more prescient since the early 2000s, when that sort of bigger than life production of The Wall was revived. And the theme of war and what it does to people, both the men who fight it and the victims of it, whether civilian or otherwise, this was a theme very deeply explored in the final Pink Floyd album that Roger did, which was The Final Cut, a much underrated album, not as musically adventurous as the previous ones, which was a source of tension in the band, but thematically, it really is one of the best. And I think that Roger's first solo album, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, was a bit more delving into the personal, but by Radio Chaos at the end of the 80s, he was back to talking about these meta concepts, if you will, about war and peace, social isolation, justice, materialism, all of these things. And you could really say that his next solo album in the early 90s, which featured Jeff Beck on guitar, Amused to Death, really was in many ways the culmination of all of the themes Roger had been dealing with, all of his lyrical and thematic life. And then, of course, there was David Gilmour, the other man up front in Pink Floyd. I've talked before about how in the 70s and in 60s, the sound of Pink Floyd was in many ways created by Richard Wright on keyboards. And if that's the case, which I believe it is, Gilmour served as sort of a musical leader which counteracted and balanced Roger's thematic and poetic leadership. A wonderful guitar player who's in many ways the master of melodic playing. He never really shredded, he never really showed off, but he was able to tastefully and consistently play melody-based guitar solos that were probably the best melody-based guitar solos of all time. And his very smooth voice was again a great counterbalance to the more screaming, pugnacious voice of Roger Waters. Now, obviously, they fell out and the band fell apart because of their differences. Roger wanted to go increasingly in a thematic direction, where Gilmour wanted to go increasingly in a more melodic direction. And eventually the two were just at loggerheads, different people, very different lifestyles. Now we know they have even different views on things going on in the world. So with all of that in hindsight, I suppose you could say that the breakup was inevitable. But during their time together, even though neither of them were very fond of one another, they did create music that was frankly perfect. Pink Floyd were the progressive rock band for people who didn't like prog rock. They were the rock band for people who didn't like rock music. They were the band who produced popular songs, frankly, long though they were, for people who didn't really conform to the pop standards of the day. And in this sense, you could argue that they were among the most successful bands in all of those genres. They were poetry for the masses, they were theater for the young, they were philosophy for the people who didn't otherwise necessarily delve deeply into these ideas, but probably in many cases did after hearing Pink Floyd. And it certainly, I think, provided a lot of therapeutic benefits for people, as music and poetry often do. So, congrats to David Gilmour on a new album. Happy birthday, Roger Waters. You won't be talking to each other, but hey, we're talking about both of you today. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.